Hampton is best known for his gripping nonfiction adventure stories set in war or depicting epic expeditions of discovery and exploration. He's the author of the best-selling histories Ghost Soldiers, Blood and Thunder, Hellhound on His Trail, and most recently, In the Kingdom of Ice, which recounts the heroic polar voyage of the USS Jeannette during the Gilded Age. He is editor-at-large for Outside Magazine and a frequent contributor to National Geographic and other magazines. His journalistic work, collected in numerous published anthologies, has been twice nominated for National Magazine Awards for feature writing. He divides his time between Santa Fe and Colorado College, where he teaches narrative nonfiction and is the journalist in residence. He was the keynote speaker for the Salute to Legislative Staff luncheon at NCSL's Legislative Summit. Each of your books feature people who are in extreme circumstances and demonstrate the qualities of leadership that allow some people to survive the ordeals and others not to survive. Your most recent book, In the Kingdom of Ice, the sad and terrible polar voyage of the USS Jeannette, describes the ordeal of a sea voyage gone terribly wrong. Can you set the stage for us?
Well, yes. This was the Gilded Age. America was beginning to sort of flex its muscles on the world stage and to compete with the European powers. This was the polar fever, the time when the world was trying to figure out what the heck is up there at the top of the world. It drove people crazy not to know what was up there, or the fact that we couldn't reach it. And so the U.S. Navy, in cooperation with an eccentric and very wealthy man named James Gordon Bennett Jr., publisher of the New York Herald, decided to team up and to try to sail to the North Pole, going past our recent acquisition from Russia, Alaska, to try to reach the North Pole by way of warm water currents that were believed to be up there. There was a theory that at the top of the world, somewhere beyond the ice, there was warm water, and there was something called the open polar sea. Obviously a wrong idea, completely wrong, dangerously wrong, as these men will soon find out. But they left in the summer of 1879 from San Francisco, very optimistic, full of enthusiasm. The ship was crammed with all the latest American inventions, like telephones and telegraphs and telegraph wire and lights that Edison had just invented, and thought they might reach the North Pole. What they found instead was ice, and they drifted in the ice pack for over 2 years till they finally sank. The ship sank to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, and these men are out on the ice trying to figure out a way to get home. And that's when really the story of leadership and comradeship and all these incredible qualities start to emerge.
You told our NCSL legislative leaders and also the people in the staff luncheon today that the first quality of leadership displayed by the captain was planning. Mm-hmm. How did that play out?
Well, obviously things go wrong in these expeditions, and you can only plan so well and so far. But as much as we might think that this was a crazy and half-cocked mission, nothing could be farther from the truth. Captain DeLong read everything. He had all the scientists on board. He had the best maps, the best charts, the best scientists. Consulted everybody. Crammed his ship, as I said earlier, with all the latest inventions. Had enough food for 3 years, researched everything. And his planning, the degree and scope of his planning really shows during the expedition. I mean, no one dies during this 2 years. There's no scurvy. The men are well fed. And the expedition, although it's very boring, they're stuck with each other essentially for these 2 years as they drift slowly north in the ice pack. All the extent of his planning starts to show in that period of 2 years.
You also mention competition, which might not at first glance seem to be relevant to survival.
Right, sort of in tandem with teamwork. I mean, he believed obviously the men needed to stick together, but the best way to organize that, he decided, was to divide them into groups that would kind of compete with each other. He essentially created rivalries. three groups. Each group had its own songs, its own flag, its own motto, its own leader. And by creating this kind of friendly rivalry amongst the three groups, he was able to goad them and encourage them to go farther across the ice pack during that summer of 1881 as they tried to make their way toward open water.
How did routine and discipline factor into the struggle?
During the 2 years that they were drifting in the ice, if DeLong had allowed them to sit around thinking about how bored they were, how crazy they were, any number of things would have happened. Mutiny, drunkenness, fights, you name it. He kept them busy every single day, taking a lot of scientific measurements, hunting, doing exercises out on the ice. Every minute of every day was planned and choreographed by DeLong. And they kept them active, it kept their minds active, and it also produced many logbooks full of data, scientific data, which ended up in the National Archives in Washington, data which is now being studied by Arctic scientists who are interested in sort of the history of global warming, and it's provided this amazing baseline of information for climatologists.
Why was what you call a sense of play important to all this?
Yeah. Well, a sense of play, I think in any of these stories where things are really grim and gothic and difficult, and there's all this striving and all this stress, I found that, and I think it's common sense. All of us know people like this who, even in the worst of circumstances, can have a sense of humor and a sense of play, a sense of, in this case, DeLong understood that was important. There were musicals, and there was a printing press where they printed a newspaper with lots of jokes and limericks and wordplay and puns. This was vital to keep the morale up for the duration of this expedition, and I found that those who had the better sense of humor tended to get along better, and it's a key element really of survival.
There was a particular punster.
Mm-hmm. There was this one guy, yes. His name was Collins, and he was a meteorologist, he was a scientist, but he was also an Irishman with a great sense of wordplay, and unfortunately he had this terrible penchant for delivering really bad puns. They were puns. They were sort of groaners, right? And they were funny, as those things go. We all know people like this. Like an hour or two, they can be the life of the party. They're wonderful, but for 2 years, Collins, everyone was trying to wring his neck by the end of this expedition because they'd heard all of his jokes. But at the same time, they appreciated his humor.
Faith and stoicism were both important elements, you're right.
Yeah. As you're moving into a part of the world that no man has ever seen before, it might as well be the dark side of the moon. It is literally dark 24 hours a day for much of that period. If you don't have faith that you're going to get through this, faith in something larger than yourself, you're not going to make it. And all these men, you see it in their diaries, you see it in their journals, faith in God, faith in their country, faith in science, faith in the legitimacy and the rightfulness of this mission, faith in the Navy, faith in their families and their women back home. It's really important balancing element in these expeditions. If you don't have that, you're prone to despair, and you can become a downward spiral.
Were you surprised, and what does it say about these men, that they were able to maintain a sense of wonder about their surroundings?
Yeah. It's like it was so difficult and so much of the time, and it was dark, and it was cold, and it was dreary, and it was miserable. I mean, Arctic stories are famous for their misery, right? But at the same time, there were always these moments of wonder, of weird mirages and the weird ways in which sound would travel over the ice. There's a atmospheric effect in the Arctic known as the Fata Morgana, which causes like stacks and stacks of an image. So it looks like a great fortress or a castle. Of course, there's the Aurora Borealis. There's all of these kinds of atmospheric phenomena and amazing wildlife and a lot of beauty out there. And Captain DeLong in his journals and all the other participants talk about how amazing it is and how lucky they are to be in this part of the world that no man has ever seen before. And it's like they're like little kids pinching themselves because they're so excited to be somewhere where no one else has ever been. So that sense of wonder seems to be an important characteristic getting people through these ordeals.
Humility is a quality that is, in some sense, in fairly short order these days.
Yeah.
But you write about how important that was from the captain's perspective of the world he was going into.
Yeah. I mean, you know, a lot of Navy captains, and this was particularly true of the British Admiralty, a lot of their expeditions in the Arctic were characterized by a lot of arrogance and hubris of like, we can just transport Victorian English society into the ice and we'll have tea every day and we'll live and dress like Brits. And you know, DeLong understood that he needed to take into account the knowledge base of the Inuit, of the people who've been living there for millennia. They know how to survive. They know how to live in the wilderness of the Arctic. And so you'll see time and time again how he relies on the two Inuit hunters that are on board the ship, and in terms of their knowledge of hunting, their knowledge of the weather, their knowledge of how to dress, and to deal with the dogs. Also, another tribe called the Yakuts figure prominently in this story. In Siberia, when they make landfall, they're saved by the Yakuts, an amazing tribe that rely on reindeer and know how to survive the Siberian winter. So to his credit, DeLong took into account all of this knowledge and all this expertise, really, that the natives had. And it's pretty, it seems like that should be obvious, right? But back then, that was not obvious. There was a lot of racism. There was a lot of sense of superiority among Anglo society, European society. They don't know what they're talking about. We'll do it our way. And it usually led to their death.
These are stranded in a wasteland, wilderness. And yet, your research showed that there was, I think, a prevailing sense of optimism that they had. How do you think they maintained that? And how important was that?
Yeah. Probably the all-pervasive, quality that you have to have if you're going to be an explorer, if you're going to be someone who's going to deliberately go into harm's way and try to get through an ordeal like this. Captain DeLong had it. Every page of his journal, you'll see a tendency to sort of understate the misery, to exaggerate the good qualities of the day. He had this motto, nil desperandum, which is Latin for never despair, and it became a kind of a cheer and a kind of his motto. It was kind of an infectious optimism that all the men came to share. And even on days when obviously they probably shouldn't have been optimistic, he seemed to have it. It was sort of hardwired into his personality, and it comes across in those journals. And I believe when every other quality that we've just been talking about failed, it was still there, and it really is what got them through this.
Thank you.
Pleasure being here.